tonight's presentation by our guest. I'll call on Muhammad Vadi to give a little recitation from the Quran. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اجتنبوا كثيرا من الظن إن بعض الظن إثم ولا تجسسوا ولا يغتب بعضكم بعضا أيحب أحدكم أن يأكل لحم أخيه ميتا فكرهتموه واتقوا الله إن الله تواب رحيم. يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير. In the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful, O you who believe, abstain from many of the suspicions. Some suspicions are sins. And do not be curious to find out the faults of others. And do not backbite one another. Does one of you like that he eats the flesh of his dead brother? You would avoid. And fear Allah. Surely Allah is most relenting, most merciful. O mankind, we have created you from a male and a female, and made you into races and tribes, so that you may identify one another. Surely the noblest of you in Allah's sight is the one who is most righteous from among you. Surely Allah is all-knowing and all-aware. Subhanallah. Jazakallah Muhammad for that recitation and the translation. It's very seldom that we have a guest that doesn't need introduction. I think that's the stature of an individual where you say, so-and-so doesn't need any introduction. I think many of us sitting here are already familiar with the work of Ismail Vadi. Not only his work, but his activism and his interest in politics and his participation in the political landscape of our country. Tonight's session is almost twofold. Number one is he's going to speak a little on his book that he has. It's about the educational struggles, teachers in Lenasia and the broader context of South Africa. And the second half of his presentation is on he's got a very fancy title, he said. It's the 2024 election, voter choice and coalition politics. Now, whenever I think about Ismail, I don't regard him as a traditional historian. For me, Ismail is an activist historian. He's almost in the position of a documentary filmmaker. If you read his works, it's not about the grand narratives, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire or such big historical perspectives. Ismail's documentation of history is about little stories, otherwise known as vignettes. It's those small stories that capture human interest. It captures the very role of individuals in society that then give the grand narrative that he strives to portray. In the book that he's published recently on the struggles of teachers in Lens, it's a must-read for everyone that's interested in the political and educational struggle in this country. If you look at what has happened in the last 30 years, there's almost a subtle attempt to erase
certain sections of our history, and certain groups are almost ignored and marginalized in that whole historical process. The book has almost 45 profiles, individuals who are involved in education, in teaching, in Lens. Some are very familiar names. And each one documents their own struggles. I'm reminded of a scene in a movie called Salvador. I don't know if anyone has seen that. There's a discussion between a journalist and a photographer. And the photographer says to the journalist, he says, you know, the great photographers of the past had the ability to capture the nobility of human suffering. And why they did that, and why they were successful, was that they understood why those people died for what they struggled in. I think when you read Ismail's books, all his books, you get a very deep understanding of personal histories and personal struggles. And I ask you, everyone sitting here, please do yourself a favor, buy this book. I'm not getting a commission from you, right? Ismail, but you know, it's a necessary book to have as part of your resistance literature. The second part of his and I think let me just go sort of naturally into the second part. Towards the end of his book, the conclusion of his book, he quotes a poem by Langston Hughes. The poem is called Harlem, and the subtitle is A Dream Deferred. And the poem is very short. It asks 4 questions. And these questions I think Ismail will address in his presentation. So the poem is this: what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it just explode? And I think we, in this atmosphere where in probably 3.5 weeks' time, we go to the polls, we might have a new government in KZN, new ruling parties, new coalitions, new everything. Individuals have come up, new parties. We've got the MK party in KZN. And all of them are vying for positions, and all of them are courting our vote. So what Ismail is going to present is the various options that we have, without any particular focus on an individual or an individual party. So let's give Ismail our time and consideration, and after that, let us ask the relevant questions, because I think it's a very momentous time that we find ourselves in, and we have to make some very important decisions as individuals and as communities. And I think Ismail might not have all the answers, but he'll have some of the answers, hopefully. So without further ado, Ismail, over to you.
I think Faisal has captured it. I'm not going to really talk about the book, but just to give you some sense. There's a historical theoretical section which looks at the evolution of Indian education, a little bit about Intel, but predominantly in Transvaal. And in that section I asked only one question. The policy of the National Party was to repatriate Indian people out of this country. They became as indentured laborers, and all the time the policy was to get us out. But ironically, it was the National Party that introduced mass schooling for Indian people with the Indian Education Act in 1965. And out of that came UDW, Salisbury Island, UDW, Springfield College of Education. So I addressed that question theoretically and tried to keep the political economy of that. And then the second theoretical section looks at forms of resistance to apartheid education, but from a local community perspective. And then the profiles, I can't go through 45 profiles, but I'll just pick up on one or two of them. Murphy Thangray, people in the trial would never have heard of him, but Murphy Thangray in the 1940s became one of the few Indian principals. Up until late 1930s, Indian kids went to so-called colored schools in the Transvaal. But then TIC under Suleiman Nana and Galodas, etc., started campaigning for Indian schools, ironically, and the government conceded to that sort of request to demand. And Murphy Thangray was amongst the first few principals, and he was the principal of Denver Primary. Then came the 1946 passive resistance campaign. And Murphy Thangray was full in that campaign. He defied, some of the defiers came here to defy with the NIC, and the department fired him. Now, in those days, if you were a principal, that was a lucrative post. And they fired him, and he was banned from the 1950s right up to 1981 when we went to his funeral in Lens. Nobody in Indonesia even remembers Murphy Thangray. Ahmed Timur, I don't have to talk about him, he was a teacher. But I'll talk about two other cases. Sadek Bagiara. Some people might know Sadek Bagiara. He was a leading figure in Azapo in the Black Consciousness movement. And he was in the Sesu PPC trial with Seth Cooper, Sri Murli, Terry Lakota, etc. Sadek was a teacher. He got appointed at his school where he matriculated Lenzheim. And the first day he reported for duty in January. And then the third day, Mr. Lopgat came to him and said, Mr. we have a letter for you from Victoria, but I don't know what is this letter about. And the third day they fired him, they dismissed him for no reasons, just because of his political involvement. So he was a teacher in this country, probably the only teacher in this country that was in school for 3 days. But nobody knows this in Lens also. And with him was a very fantastic, excellent English teacher, Sorry Ismail. He was also in the Sesu PPC trial. Both him and Sadiq were acquitted. He went on to teach at the school that I eventually taught us at M.H. Joseph Technical High School. He was detained during the 1980 schools boycott. And then in 1994, just after the elections in November, he was murdered in his house, and his family found his body 2 or 3 days later. And to date, nobody has ever been arrested. Now, M.H. Joseph is a school where I taught, but there isn't even a photograph of Soli Ismail in that school. So that's the kind of history that I try and recover, because it's going to be lost and forgotten forever. And that's really what the book is about. So I'm not going to go into that. It's a worthwhile read, even if I have to say that. Let me get on to the presentation. So the last time when I was here, probably June last year, I can't remember. When does I speak here? Last year, June. Last year, June, I think the mood was decidedly against the ruling party, and the question I was raising then is, okay, let's agree that you are so aggrieved and so unhappy with whatever the ANC is doing. So what are your alternatives? That's really the big question we were trying to grapple with last year. Okay, then came October 7th, and I get a feeling that there's a mood swing now, a political mood swing, particularly in this community. And people are, I think, more open to say, look, maybe we didn't think through everything, but there is a global picture, not a national picture that we need to take into account. And so there seems to be a new openness towards the ruling party at the moment. And I know that a couple of weeks ago, Al-Baraka and Minara hosted the president, and people had the benefit of listening to him directly, and of course he was campaigning. But I still get a sense, even though we are, 20 days away from the election. No, less than 23 days away from the election. There is still a lot of uncertainty. So just yesterday my sisters were asking me, who must we vote for? Tell us who must we vote for. The people are not clear. So what I want to be doing is just giving you a sketch of the landscape without showing you any preference, but to show you where the political drift is and what are the implications of that, and how do we as a community reposition ourselves, something we will actually discuss very carefully, because I think the nature of politics in this country is starting to change. So the first point I want to make is that we are in a global and in a national era of complete unpredictability. So if anybody can predict something and say, this is exactly how it's going to happen, you can't guarantee that. And it's very difficult for us to do, let's say, strategic rethinking or repositioning in a context of global and national and sometimes even regional unpredictability. So I've just given you 4 or 5 events of the last 2 or 3 years and how they impacted on us, and we nobody predicted that. So COVID, if you think of that first few months of the hard lockdown, I think we were in a state of shock. It disrupted life globally. And suddenly Zoom became the most popular word, because all meetings were on Zoom after that. And businesses started changing their orientation, how people work, how people travel. I can tell you the transport sector, I mean public transport globally had virtually collapsed in the early days of COVID. But nobody predicted that. Nobody forewarned us of that. So that's the kind. If you take ESCOM, when I was in Parliament, Vadi Musa was the chairperson of ESCOM, 2008, 2009, I think. We had load shedding, but then we thought we had, within that wave and it's over. Nobody predicted prolonged load shedding as we are experiencing now. And so you're lucky now it's election time, you've got a bit of a relief. Who knows what's going to happen on the 30th of May and how long it's going to continue. Okay. 2021, I think you are in the heat of the moment. Nobody predicted the intensity of that disruption over 5 or 6 days. The damage to the South African economy that week is estimated at 50 billion rands of damage in terms of loss to economy, damage to public infrastructure, damage to businesses, etc. And then we've had the loss of lives of so many people. Who predicted that? We knew there might be some instability, the URS, Zuma, but nobody predicted the intensity of it and the disruption and the serious destabilization that led to it. Okay, Ukraine-Russian war, who predicted 7th of October? Nobody. I can let you into the thing. A few weeks before that, I was part of a delegation that met, a very high-level delegation from Palestine. And the thinking there was that, look, how do we try and re-energize global solidarity? How do you guys reposition yourself? Because this thing is falling off the map. I mean, the whole Palestinian issue wasn't receiving that kind of attention in the wake of the Ukraine-Russian war and other conflicts in the world. And then suddenly this thing happened, and who would have predicted the damage to Gaza as we are seeing today, and possible invasion of Rafah today, or in the next few days? Nobody predicted that. But look how the global Palestinian solidarity movement has re-energized itself, and from forces that you never anticipated. This encampment at US campuses. I mean, it happened in the war against Vietnam. And suddenly, you have universities throughout the world, people on the street, forget governments, people on the street have made this their cause. Today, the richest man or woman could be that person who sells the Palestinian scarf. So that's what I talk about, unpredictability and impact and consequences. And who would have thought that Israel is in such a defensive position and so isolated globally now in a matter of 200 and some odd days? Who would have thought that Jacob Zuma would form a new party? Nobody predicted that. We thought that, all right, we still a factor in politics, but it's going to be phasing out. And now suddenly, in a matter of months, there's a new factor in politics, particularly in this province. So that's what I'm talking about. And like that, there'll be other things that will be sprung on us in the future. And we will have to begin to take all of these things into account on an ongoing basis and review strategies and how we work, etc., on an ongoing basis. So there's a lot of scenario planning. HSRC does a lot of scenario planning. Probably some of, in the old days, in the 70s, 80s, Clem Center was very prominent in this. Now we might get Friedman also doing a little bit of scenario planning. But the Mapun Gugwe Institute, where Joel Metsazenzi used to be the head, I think Eva Umar is there at the moment. Gina also, I think, works there. So they've just released earlier this year the 2035 scenarios for where the country is. And they've got 13 indicators, social indicators, economic indicators, political indicators. And in all of those indicators, there's a negative trend. And what they're saying or suggesting is that South Africa is really in a stasis. It's unlikely to take off, and it's more likely to go down. Greater social tension, greater unemployment, greater poverty, greater political and social instability, more protests. Well, that's the scenario they are sketching. Now, you can't ignore this. I mean, these are social scientists, they are political analysts, who put together a whole host of research and trying to understand where this society is at the moment. And of course, investors get very, very jittery about this kind of scenario planning because they have to ask themselves, is it worth investing in this country? Particularly foreign investors. So that's an important factor. But the key thing, if we want to get out of this below par performance, there's one critical variable, and that is leadership. If you get the right kind of leadership from government, from the private sector, from civil society, and the unions, labor leaders, we can create a social compact on 5 or 6 big things for this country that we all say these are non-negotiable. This is what we're going to work towards. We can actually stabilize this country and take it forward. So one of the critical fault lines or weaknesses, let's say weaknesses in our society, is that we don't have that caliber of leaders and mature leaders with a broader vision than their specific interests. So unions will fight for their turf only, and that's it. And they can run antiquity to the ground, but it's their rights as workers, irrespective of the damage it does to the city over that 3 or 4 or 5 weeks. So you don't have that vision, leadership with vision. So there's a paucity of this in the country. And the tragedy, well, I wouldn't say the reality, is that the leaders of old are gone. Now there's certainly a new generation of leaders across the board. So take all the political parties there. You can count the big names. So Zuma and Ramaphosa might be of an earlier generation. But you take all the other parties, people that we haven't got the same kind of experience and wisdom. And how do you now generate that leadership to take this country forward? I think it's a very big question for us. So what are the big issues, bigger than the noses? What are the big issues for this election? Okay? And it's important that we first understand what are the big issues before we can then even say who must we vote for. The first thing, we have 42 million people in this country out of 63 million is our population. So 20 million is people under 18. 42 million people are eligible to vote in this country. They're 18 years and older. But 14.5 million people have not registered to vote. So they are out of the process already. On 29th of May, 14.5 million people can do nothing. They can't go and vote. Although they're eligible, but they didn't bother to register to participate in these elections. And a lot of them are the younger people. So It's a weakness, it's a structural weakness of our democracy and how we organize the voters. And we come to that just now. Now let's say there's a poll of 65%. So that on 29th of May, 65% of those who are now registered vote. It means 35% have not voted, although they can vote. And if that is true, that figure is true, and I think the pollsters are saying that we will end up with about a 65% vote. It means almost another 9 million people who can vote will not be voting. So 25 million of South Africans will not participate in these elections. Now that's another worrying trend. Because you can end up with less than 50% of people actually voting, and the party gets 50 of that. It means you're really working on a few million people bringing a party to power, when the vast majority of people have not exercised that right. So one of the things we are asking the civil society movements, and I think we should start campaigning for this, is that if a person is 18 years on the Home Affairs database, that person should be automatically on the voters' roll. Why do we go through this every 5 years, voter registration, voter registration, voter registration? It should be an automatic thing, and then your last known address with Home Affairs is your voting station, and if you're studying or you've moved somewhere, then you can use the voter re-registration process to update your records. Now, it's a simple amendment to the Electoral Act. You can bring everybody on the voters' roll. So that's something that I think as civil society we will have to start looking at. You're going to be having 3 ballot papers in this election, not 2. Previously, in the national elections, we had 2 ballot papers. Now we're going to be having 3 ballot papers. So you'll be voting 3 times, and you're going to make 3 choices. The first is what is called a national ballot. So there are 400 seats in Parliament, and the first ballot is for 200 seats in Parliament. And there'll be about 51, I think, political parties contesting. So you'll get 51 names, and then you'll have to make a cross next to one of them, and then that's your vote. So, if a party gets 50%, it means they'll get 100 of those 200 seats. Okay? The remaining 200 is now what they call the regional ballot. So if you see the map there, each province has got an allocation of seats. They make up 200 seats for Parliament. And whatever you vote in your province, whatever the percentage, when they do the calculation by virtue of a formula, that number of political representatives from different parties will go to Parliament to make up the remaining 200. Now, if a party does very badly in the regional vote, but gets, say, 50% in the national vote, so let's say party ABC, I don't want to mention any names, so they get 100 in the 50%, but then because of their weaknesses in the provinces now, they end up with, say, 94 seats. In Parliament, they have 194 seats. Parliamentary majority is 201. So that's our implication. This regional ballot is a very, very important ballot for political parties. And we have not even understood, as the ordinary electorate, what is the power of that regional ballot. Because we all think it's just going to be like 400 seats like before. It's not going to be that. Okay. And then you've got what is called the provincial ballot. That's for your provincial legislature. I don't know where's the headquarters now? Still in Maritzburg. We are in Joburg, in Gauteng. So whatever the number of seats are there, I know in Gauteng it's now 80 seats, it's been increased. So you vote for the premier, well, all of us, premier and the MECs, and all the members of the provincial legislatures. For the first time, we have independent candidates. We've never had that before. So it has not really gained traction. What I understand, there are only 6 candidates that have been cleared by the IEC, but somebody told me the other day there's only 11. But a very familiar name is Zaki Ahmed from Cape Town. He's done an extensive campaign. He's very likely to get it. But in Gauteng, if you are an independent candidate, you're going to need about 85,000 votes to get it. In this province, if you're an independent candidate, you're probably going to need about 75,000 votes. It's very difficult for an individual to marshal that kind of support unless you're very, very important. So this is a new phenomenon, and we don't know how many, because there are so few independent candidates in the first place, who will actually make the threshold, we don't know. So this is another factor. So you might see on the what's called the regional ballot, you'll have parties, and if there's an independent candidate from your province, well, you can vote for that individual. That individual then will represent you in national parliament. Okay, so there's an important nuance that is there now. But what I'm going to now give you guys is just the latest polls. I actually forgot to put the one that's come out on Saturday, but I remember most of it. So there have been 5 or 6 major polls that have been taking place since November 22, April 23, August, October 23, April this year, April, and then on Saturday, day before yesterday, Saturday, May, there's a new poll that has come out. Now, polling is a science, but pollsters can get it wrong, okay? Because of this unpredictability factor that I talk about in society. And although the polls, normally they say they've got a margin of error of 3% this way or the other, but nobody knows because it also depends on voter turnout. If there's a voter turnout of say 70%, the ANC's percentage is likely to be lower. If there's a voter turnout of 40%, the ANC's turnout percentage will be lower. If the voter turnout is around 60, 65, the ANC is likely to score. So it depends on, and nobody can predict how many people are actually going to come out to vote. It's going to be in winter. If there's a freak storm on that day, or there's violence in a particular area, well, it might have, and it's very cold, people might not come out to vote. So that's the unpredictability factor. So if you look at the ANC, all the polls, except the first one in April, showing that the ANC is likely to get under 50%. And the one that came out on Saturday, it shows the ANC at 44%. Okay, now let me make one point. From 1948 to 1990 till 2024, we have always been governed by one dominant party. As a national party, they were the rulers, and there's one party that ruled from 1948 to 1994, and from 1994 to 2024, it has been the ANC that has been governed. We might be now entering an era with no majority party. Whether it's a freak thing for this election, or whether this will be the trend for the next 2 or 3 decades, time will tell. This is a very significant factor. Very, very significant factor. For 75 years, we had one party dominance. Now we might not have that in this country. And that's something we have to start factoring in our thinking, in our imagination. The DA is only going to get probably under 25%, and Saturday's poll they were sitting at 23%. So it's unlikely that it's going to swing. So if ANC is brought out in Baki and Khalima and Buza and some big names now, Tokyo and others, maybe they can swing to just over 50%. Maybe not. Okay. IFP, well, on average, I think they're consistently around 5 to 6%. EFF was the only party was growing up until last year. It's now taking a nosedive, and that means that some of their supporters are likely to be voting for MK and not the ANC. And so you can see that they're down to 12%. Saturday's poll was, I think, 11.5%. So they're still taking a bit of a nosedive. MK, right? And I made the point, it's in the Caxton newspaper, what is it? Citizen had an article quoting me saying that from December, they announced in December, if they're showing 13% in 5 months, it is phenomenal growth. Right now they've got internal tensions and there's lots of internal problems, but it is driven by a personality. politics of a personality. But the figures, I mean, they have outsmarted MK if these figures are correct. In a matter of 5 months. That's the fluidity. This is this unpredictability that I'm talking about politics. Action South Africa Freedom Fund 2, 1.5. The rest of the parties, all of them, will be in the camp of 6 or 7%. They don't even come on the radar screen as 1%. All of them. Al-Jamaa, AM4C, Sun Party, COPE, POSA, AZAPO, PAC, all bankrupt of them. So that's the reality. So you have now 50 or 40 other parties that won't even come in the 5% mark. The only party that's showing some growth is Patriotic Alliance, and it's in the Western Cape. I'll show you that as a new formation. The others, unless there's a miracle, they'll be lucky if they get 1% or 1.5%. They could be about it, I don't know. Now I'm going to give you, it's a bit dense, but I'm going to try and unpack this so that we're not going to go through all the provinces. I just highlighted for you the available research for Gauteng, for KZN, and Western Cape. And I think the first two are really of interest because I come from one and you come from the other. So you'll see there's 4 polls: Ipsos, October 23, Rising Zanzi, February 24. We know the researcher is a good friend of ours, is a credible scientist. So you can't discount, I mean, we know them personally. It's not just some figment of the imagination. Mark Ocken, I think he does for the Social Research Foundation. And then again now, as I said on Saturday, the Social Research Foundation's results for the provinces. So look at the ANC. It can't get more than 35% in that province, based on these figures. And a miracle occurs and a miracle occurred. Right? Now, I've been in that legislature for almost 10 years. In the last election, we got 50.15. It was 2019. 50.15. If this figure is correct, it has dropped 16 points in 5 years. Okay? The moonshot bet, multi-party charter, all of them put together can't get 35%. So you're going to have a hung legislature in Gauteng. And the kingmakers are there. EFF, Action South Africa is doing okay, and MK. Because any of the two camps, ANC on one side and the multi-party charter on the other, they're going to need 15 or 16% to become the majority or the governing coalition. What is the implication of that for politics? Okay. Look at Job Roberts. Okay. The ANC in the last elections, if I remember correctly, the Zuma factor and all that, I think it was 59%, if I'm not mistaken. At the moment, the ANC is hovering under 30% in this province. And Saturday's poll put them at 28%. You know what's a nosedive, isn't it? That's a political nosedive. When the plane starts going like this, you're like expecting a crash. That's where the ANC is, if these figures are correct. Okay? Look at the DA. So it's increasing, it's picking up in this province to 23. The IFP is sort of hovering between 18, 19, and 20%. EFF is the only party that's also dropping significantly, and that support is going to MK, which is 24%. So MK theoretically is outstripping even the DA in this province. And then this other the 4 will be all the other small parties. You only have a hung parliament in this province. And you can work out which coalition will now come into power. Look at the figures, they're all sitting in the 20s. So you need 30% more to form a government. So who's going to get into bed with whom? That's the roll the dice. this provincial vote and the province to the national, this regional vote, that ballot, both are absolutely vital. In this community, our community, we don't hold our ballots too small in number, but we're important, because here you have a sizable number. You can shift it 3-4% one way or the other. Or maybe even 5%, depending on what percent of people come out to vote. But it would be a tragedy if our community splashes this vote out. Sun, Al-Jama, AM4C, little bit IFP, little bit MK, little bit ANC, little bit T. You might as well spoil your ballot. You need a strategic approach to this. And since last year I've been telling people, set up a strategic session to think about the changing nature of politics and how we have to reposition ourselves, what initiatives we have to take. Because we are permanently in a reactive mode. You can't just be reacting to unfolding events. Yeah, some events are unpredictable, so we have to react. But we also can take initiative that puts us in a better space. So now, I know in your mind, I know that many of you have spoken to a good number in the last few weeks, even telephonically. You're asking me, who must we vote? What must we do? I don't know. You are in this province. This is a politically volatile province. You will have to make decisions. And you only got 20 some odd days to start factoring that out, figuring it out, and giving leadership. Again, this is a crisis of leadership in our own community, because we don't want to pull together and give direction to people. So I don't know how many strategic sessions you've had with all sorts of people coming here, but we just don't move. So I must now take out the luckily and have to do that. Because this is, it puts us in a very disadvantaged position. 5 minutes. No. Okay, so Kanita Anta, now she's left, she's designed as a journalist with News 24. They're important and very useful book, nothing new, but what they're saying, that this election is as important, if not more important than 1994. South Africa is at a crossroads. It is at a critical juncture, and leadership is going to be the key factor for the future. And if you make bad choices, then you end up with this very fancy word that the doctors can explain what it is. It's leaders of the lowest caliber. And I'm not worried about the big word, I just worry about the first 3 letters. We mustn't end up with that. If we don't think carefully about leadership, we should end up with that 3 letters. Then you can cry for the next 5 years. I'll come back, inshallah. Then you can lament. It is an important election for future leadership in this country. This, published in 2018, Leon Schreiber is in Parliament now for the TA. So forget about that. See what he's saying, what the analysis is saying. We can agree or disagree, it's fine. But he makes 2 points, 2 critical points. 2 decades from now, 2044, okay, it will seem almost absurd that South African politics was once totally dominated by the ANC. It will soon lose its iron grip on the country's politics, with ANC single-party governments replaced by a broad range of political coalitions. And I think in this election, the scenario seems to be set for that eventuality. But look, the most important point is number 2. The end of ANC majorities will probably mean the beginning of no majorities, except in the Western Cape. There'll be a DA majority in the next election, this coming election. So if we are entering the era of coalition politics, have we prepared for that? Have we have a mature leadership that can take the country into coalition politics? So the city of Joburg, we've had now coalitions for the last 9 years. We've had 7 mayors in 9 years. 7 mayors. Every year, 18 months, we unseat some party, new coalition. 2 weeks ago, they took out the mayor in Ikuru and now we've got a new mayor. If you have that kind of coalition politics in the provinces, or even national, then you're just into a phase of political instability and where politicians are just trading positions for themselves, who will get which position, and the public won't feature in that politics. Whereas in Europe, for example, they have coalition governments. Very stable. There's a clear regulatory framework, a legal framework. Parties put out their manifestos. Even the coalition parties put out their manifesto ahead of an election to say, if we come as a coalition to power, this is what we promise. And then they stabilize that coalition and they govern. So we just, the last few years have shown that we don't have that maturity. It's not there in the metros. And what makes us believe that it's going to come automatically in the provinces or even nationally? So what's likely to happen? If we have a possibly good scenario after post-election, if major parties put aside their differences, their leaders, they commit to constitutionalism, the rule of law, economic reform, and spurring economic growth, then I think we could get a central movement, central sort of force to start taking, to stabilize the country and to get it. It is possible. It's a function of leadership. The bad, and this is, I mean, people don't like the Blantyre Foundation. So Craig Mills and Ray Hartley, and they're writing for that, and they say these are people promoting regime change. But it's their thinking. They expect saying that an ANC-EFF coalition in this country will be disastrous. But if you want short-term political survival, it might be the coalition of the day. How big in this province? I don't know. So suddenly, even Malema is saying he's prepared to enter into coalition with the ANC, but he says, I'm also prepared to talk to the DA. For the first time, Steenhuisen is saying, I'm prepared to enter into a coalition with the ANC if it means keeping out the ANC-EFF coalition. So even they are now starting to weigh up political possibilities and options. Okay? And if we have the ugly, well, they refer it as ugly, I don't subscribe to that. It means that the ANC might just make 51%, 50%, 48 and get coalition partners with small parties. And you'll get more of what we have at the moment. Possibly 1% economic growth, policy ambiguity, moving backward and forward on issue of corruption, really not taking the country forward, and we sort of stagger on. And we just keep the system afloat, maybe with a bit of management and sometimes maybe with autopilot, I don't know. Fine, all right, have I got a few more minutes? No, a little bit more, a little bit more. So what are the possible coalitions? So we've got a multi-party charter, 11 parties committed to that, 9 of them have been approved by the IEC, so they will be coming in. But all the polls show that collectively they'll make 35%. So they can't constitute a government unless somebody else or some other parties join them and it's plus 15%. Okay? There's another coalition in the making. You might not have heard it and they don't announce it. Okay? But that's MK. Viswan Palais, is it? Viswan Vadi. Yeah. Then ACES, African Congress for Transformation. Then you've got African Transformation Movement. Then you've got African Movement Congress of Roy Woodley. I saw his poster here, you can put him there also. And then you've got the independent African churches who are now entering the political terrain. Some elements from the Shembe Church, some elements from the ZCC, influential. They were rallying around Mokweng, but Mokweng has now said he doesn't want to be in a party structure, but God has inspired him that he will be the president of this country. Okay. So it's possible. Right. And then you've got Cloudy Motsoeneng's outfit there in the Free State. But this is a coalition in the making. And add to this possible EFF linkage, and they become a new factor in politics in this province. In this province. They can become a ruling coalition in this province. Not impossible. Okay. So ANC is holding its cards to its chest. It says, we're going to win this election. Yeah, it's politics, I know. We can't say we're forming a coalition because then we're already conceding that we're losing the elections. So, they're the ruling party. But the ANC has said in October last year, no coalition with the EFF. Yet in Gauteng, in the macros, they're keeping the coalition with the EFF because Gauteng is defined. Now, as Steenhuisen has said, he's prepared to talk to the ANC. And Malema has also said, I'm prepared to talk to the ANC, but Fred must become the Minister of Finance. I don't know which bank he was. I don't know if the money will be what, but he must be the Minister of Finance. I don't know, man. He just wanted an award. So, and then we don't know all the other parties, all the other small parties. So Al-Jama might possibly go through with the ANC, I would think so. But we don't know what's the position of all the other smaller parties. But if you open together a coalition of, say, 10, 12 parties, that thing is fragile. But it might be necessary, depending on the percentage that people get, or parties get. So we have to start thinking about coalition politics. And we, in our constitution and our regulatory legal framework, allows for it, but there's nothing that manages and regulates it and guides it. So we have to pass some law or amend the constitution which now factors into the possibility of more ongoing coalition politics. We need some legal constitutional people to start thinking about that. There's this issue of 1% threshold, so the Deputy President Paul Mashatile invited all the parties late last year to Parliament to talk about this, and he said, look, the DA and the ANC saying it must be 1% threshold. So any party that gets below 1% can't be part of a coalition. So you take Joburg, there are 270 councillors. Al-Jama got 3 councillors out of 270. But Al-Jama is the mayor.
Al-Jama has been 2 mayors.
There are 2 mayors. One was pulled out, now they got another mayor. So from 270, you make Al-Jama of 3 people, you make them the mayor. How do you govern like that? And of course, Al-Jama says that's a great achievement for them. Maybe it is. Maybe other people think, but you guys are just being dangled by a string. I don't know. So you can't end up like that. With so many small parties trying to constitute a government. Governments are, this coalition governments are, if they survive 12 months is an achievement. They're just collapsing every now and then. And it's musical chairs. So shall we say that a coalition should be 5 years? Or can only be reviewed midterm after 2.5 years? Then there's some certainty. Should we be, what's the public interest? So all these coalitions are formed, and there are 85 municipalities that the ANC is involved in coalitions in the country now. What's the policy that drives it? What's their program? We only hear about personality changes, but we don't know what's in the public interest. Should we, by law, change our constitution and say any election, the first 3 parties must constitute a government, like the government of national unity that we had in 1994. It was by choice. The ANC would won the election, but we said, Azapu come, IFP come, EAC come, even National Party, our adversaries come in the government. You create stability, you create certainty, you build confidence, you manage the tensions, and it survived for almost 2.5 years. And the Nats pulled out and collapsed it. So should we begin to think in terms of the idea of a government of national unity rather than ad hoc coalitions? It's a policy matter. So anytime I make an important point, when voters don't give a single party a firm mandate, it means that leaders must transcend their differences to act in the public interest. And coalition experience so far is that they act in their self-interest, not in the public interest. So how do we change that mindset? And what's the role of civil society, groups like this, to start putting pressure on the political parties, on coalitions, to put the public interest first and not the last. Right, last slide. It's getting angry. Told him I'm in trouble when he told me he's sharing the meeting. There have been threats to violence to this election. In the run-up to this election, we have to be vigilant. On election day, we have to be very vigilant. And then it takes the IEC to do the counting. And already some people are starting to discredit the IEC. And some people are saying they will not accept the election results if we don't get so many percent. And then after that announcement, you've got 14 days to constitute the government where coalition talks might have to take place. How do we maintain peace, political peace and stability in this next 6 weeks in your province? And if something goes seriously wrong, say on election day, or immediately after the election results are announced, and one party believes it is going to get 65%, and it ends up with 8%, and then it takes to the streets. So we've seen in Kenya disputed elections, presidents can't be appointed, then you're into another stalemate, another tension. So we in civil society, through the various foundations, Defend Our Democracy, etc., we have now registered about 1,500 independent civil society monitors, a good number of them in this province also, so that we can also monitor the elections, particularly in some hot points, to see whether we can say elections are free or fair. If there's potential for violence, we can independently call the parties and say, no, let's stop this type of thing. Play some role. And I'm hoping that some of you will assist in that process. Thanks, Faisal. Sorry I've exceeded your time.
Jazakallah. Ismail. As usual, food for thought. Many questions you've raised. I hope you have all the answers that will be asked of you. I think I don't know whether it's tragic or we've reached a state where it's unbelievable that almost 3 weeks before an election, no one is talking about manifestos. No one is talking about what is it that parties have to offer us. Now, I did a little exercise going through the manifestos. It's the nerdiness in me. I read every manifesto of every party. And the party that had the biggest manifesto, 270 pages, was the EFF. And the EFF has promised everything to everyone. Free education, free this, free that, free everything. And then I said, let me balance that out with the other political parties. And none of the other parties were any different, but to a lesser scale in what they promised. Whether it's the ANC, DA, Action SA, and RISE. I mean, the biggest disappointment was RISE in Zanzi. The manifesto, which for me is the blueprint for what a future government should be looking like. And one of the things I learned in the last 15 years when you monitor elections is that when a political party puts a manifesto, if it is not costed, it's a waste of time. It's a dream. It's a wish list. And I learned that when I studied the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn before the 2019 elections. And his manifesto was 52 pages. And each policy that they promised was costed. In other words, they had detailed figures on where they would get the funding from. So if they said, I'm just giving you a random thing, they said, we will give you 50% free education. They were able to determine where they would get that money from the fiscus and how they would balance the books. Unfortunately, none of our political parties has done that exercise, which makes you think about what is this grand wish list that they have. So that's the tragedy, that we are not talking about manifestos, but we're talking about the idea that there are certain individuals and historical parties that will then determine the future for the next 5 years. I think the other point that I want to make is that, Zuma said that the ANC will rule until Jesus comes back. I'm beginning to think whether he's going to have a name change because he's just now re-emerged as the next Messiah. Let's leave it at that. It's 20 to 9. We'll take questions till about